process at Homeboy Industries. I also sit on our management team, which is the team that pretty much we pretty much run the place collectively and make sure that Father Greg's vision is being maintained and our culture is vibrant throughout our organization, because we've grown into a pretty large organization. We're a $19 million a year organization. I think we have like 9 social enterprises now. But I came in the doors as a trainee. Well, I came in the doors as a broken man, and then I became a trainee. They didn't call it trainees back then. We were called junior staff. But I entered into this community of tenderness. And at first, when I came through the doors, I was allergic to it, because the way that I was raised, it was a lot opposite from the way that Homeboy Industries is. So I was brought up in a household, generational gang culture. All my family, my grandmother, my grandparents, they were born in this country, and they were involved in gangs probably since like the 40s, 50s. And my mother was a gang member. I didn't know who my father was growing up, but I had his name. I knew that I had his name, but I had never met this man. So I grew up in this household, and I thought things that were going on in my house were normal. Like, alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, domestic violence. And now that I look back, there was mental illness as well. So I was a young kid, and I had a cousin. So I'm the oldest of 5, but I had a cousin that was a little bit older than me, and he was like a brother to me. And we used to take care of each other when we were young. And he was wise beyond his years. And we promised to never be from the hood. Like, we promised to never get jumped into a gang. We promised each other. I remember one day at my grandmother's house, he calls me outside to the backyard, and he says, "Hey, promise me no matter what happens that we're never going to get jumped into the hood." And we shook hands. We're about 11 years old, 10, 11 years old. And we promised one another that we would never get jumped into a gang. And all of our family members, our cousins, uncles, they were all from the same gang. And my house was like the hangout spot. So the summer right before junior high school, methamphetamine had kind of like hit the neighborhood pretty hard, and people started to experiment with that, and my mother was one of those people. And she became addicted instantly to meth. So we were very poor, and lights getting turned off. I always say that even the water bill, and that's like the cheapest bill you can afford, was turned off. I remember like knowing how to bird bat before I ever went to jail. And the summer right before junior high school, my cousin got jumped into the hood. He didn't tell me anything. He didn't say he was considering it. It just happened from one day to another. And his circumstances were similar to mine. And so I remember like wondering like, damn, why did he do that? But I never asked him. And so I had another friend that I would hang out with down the street. His name was Christian. And I used to love being at their house, because they had like a semi-normal life. They had food in their refrigerator. They had basic cable TV. And, they had things that we didn't have. And I didn't have a curfew growing up, so I could stay out until whatever time I wanted to. And I would always go to this friend's house. And, I was young, so I didn't really understand that. I was overstaying my welcome. And his mother would have to ask me to leave. It'd be like 10:30 at night, 11. And she would say, "Hey, Jose, it's time to go home now." But I didn't want to go home, because I hated it at home. And so one night I walked down to his house, and I knock at the door like I always did. And somebody comes to the peephole, but they didn't answer the door. So I go to the side window, and I knock on the side window, and I say, "Hey, it's me, Jose. It's Jose." And they turned off the living room light, and they turned off the TV, and they pretended as if they weren't home. And I remember how I felt inside, and I was 12 years old at the time. I felt hurt and broken, and I felt unwanted. And so I walked home. And because my house was the hangout spot, there was always gang members at my house. So my other cousin, who was 16 at the time, and another homie who was 19 at the time, were at the top of the hill when I got there. And I guess the homie could see it on my face, because he says, "Hey, homie, why you look so sad? Did your dog die or something?" And I remember going like, trying to contain my sadness and pretend that I was okay. I told him, "No, I'm good." And he asks me, he says, "Do you want to get jumped into the hood?" And it was before I could even realize I had said yes. It was already the words had already came out of my mouth, and I said, "Yeah, I'll get into the hood." And I was 12 years old, and so we walked across the street, and they jumped me. You know, they beat on me, they kicked me, I fell, they got me up, they beat on me some more, and then when they were finished, they hugged me, and they embraced me, and it was this fractured, fissured, twisted form of love. But it was love nonetheless. I thought it was love nonetheless at the time. And I remember my cousin, he goes into the house and he comes out with a pair of pants. And we used to dress a certain way back then in the 90s. And he comes out with these pants and he hands them to me and he says, "Try these on." And then he's like, you can use those pants. And then when I had put the pants on, he looks at me and he says, "Matter of fact, homie, you can have those pants." And I remember feeling something like, I felt like he cared, you know, which maybe he did, but didn't really know how to show it in a positive way. And so I became from a gang at 12 years old. And like 8 months, give or take, after we had got jumped into the hood, after promising one another that we would never be from a gang, my cousin Marlon was murdered. And he was 14 years old. He was murdered. And that experience began to shape the way that I saw the world. I didn't know it, but it was shaping the way that I viewed the world and I viewed myself in the world. And so, you know, I remember being at his car wash and it was just violence and this is what we're gonna do. And so I began to learn, like I didn't know what it was to be a gang member when I got jumped in. But those experiences led to other experiences that led to darker places. And when I was 15 years old, I went to juvenile hall for the very first time, and I was for selling drugs, and I got 4 months. And I was like, I remember like after that moment, the rest of my life was like a blur because I was in and out of the system, mostly in the system. My mother got worse on drugs, and she wasn't able to really be there for us, you know. So when I was like 16 years old, I was in juvenile hall. And I remember like kids were getting visits and I made a conscious decision. I grew up fast, so I started to understand like these were my circumstances. And being in there, I was gonna have to live a certain way. And I knew that my name was not gonna get called when it was visiting time. And I remember being in my cell, I was on unit separation for fighting. And at 16 years old, I made a conscious decision. I said, I'm not gonna hope for anything else. Like this is my life and I'm gonna live like this until I die, and hopefully death comes soon. And I pursued that. And so I got out at 18. I went back. I did 4 years. I got out for 5 months and I went back for 6 more years. And throughout this time in my life, I had this relationship with my mother that was very unhealthy. First time I ever did drugs was with my mom. And then I began to resent her. And I remember because my mom's from the same gang as me, and homies would tell me like, "Hey, your mom's over here. She's getting high. You should go check on her." And I used to tell them I don't have a mother, because that's how much resentment I had towards her. And on my last prison term, I had just left the county. I caught the chain to go to reception, and when I got to reception, I had found out that my mother had died. And words can't describe this brokenness. Not for the loss of her so much, but for not being able to tell her how I really felt about her. Because all my life growing up in the system, I would write letters to her and I would never send them because I was afraid that if I showed her that I loved her, she was just gonna hurt me. I remember being a kid and being in the hole, I would write letters to her and then I would rip them up and I would flush them down the toilet because I was so afraid of being hurt by her. So the brokenness was more for not being true to myself and not being able to tell her that I really loved her and I needed her. And she passed away and my life became very dark. I was on my last shoot term, and I remember I was in the hole and I was looking at this little tiny mirror that was on the wall, and I was thinking about my life and where it had gotten to, and for whatever reason something was stirring in me, like I didn't want to die like that. And I remember looking at my reflection and I asked myself, excuse my language, I asked myself, I go, who the fuck are you? And how did you get here? Like, how did you get to this moment? And I didn't have the answer to that question. I didn't know about trauma, and I didn't know about how my experiences as a kid had shaped the way that I responded to my circumstances and responded to the world. I didn't know none of those things then, but something began to stir in me. And I had heard about Father Greg, but you hear stories that you don't believe, like that there's somebody out there helping gang members, you know? Anyway, I paroled from prison. I got married while I was in prison, and I paroled, and I thought, like, if I get a job, like, everything's gonna be all right. I don't want to go back to prison anymore. I knew I didn't want to die in prison. And so I paroled, and I was working in the factories in Vernon, and I was struggling. And I couldn't even utter the things that I was going through because I was ashamed of anxiety attacks, and I was ashamed of the way that I was feeling in the supermarket. So I couldn't share with anybody, and I kept it to myself, and I began to drink a lot heavily. And drugs and alcohol have always been a factor in my life since I was young. Since the first time I did them, I wanted to escape. And now that I was out again, I didn't want to feel what I was feeling, and I didn't have anybody to talk to about the way that I was feeling. So I began to drink heavily. I would wake up in the morning and I would drink. I began to get high. And it was only a matter of time before I was going to lose myself again and go back to the system. And I would get these odd jobs, like I would work for a week or 2 weeks, and then they would say, hey, there's no more work. So I'd have to go to another agency and find a job. And this was just like the cycle that I was in. And then my father-in-law, I guess he had mercy on me or compassion, and he seen me one day. I had just got out of work, and he had the La Opinión, and there was an article about Homeboy in there. Excuse me. And he says, you should call them. Like, maybe they can help you. And for whatever reason, I called him. And I remember the homie Eddie was working at the front desk. And there was a homie, he answers the phone, and he goes, Homeboy Industries, how can I help you? And I said, I'm looking for a job. Are you guys hiring? And he says, well, let me ask you a few questions. I'm like, all right. He says, have you ever been locked up before? And I'm like, yeah, I've been locked up. He goes, you ever been from a gang or anything? And I'm like, yeah, I'm from a gang. He goes, are you on probation or parole? And I'm tripping out on these questions, you know, and I'm like I'm being honest with him though. For whatever reason, I'm like, yeah, I'm on parole. I'm on high control parole. And he goes, one more question. Do you have any visible tattoos? And I remember looking at myself, and I was sleeved up, my hands, face. And I go, yeah, I'm all tatted up. And he goes, we'll give you a job. And I remember holding the phone and looking at the phone going, like, are you serious? And he's like, I'm serious, we'll give you a job. And I was so excited, and I couldn't believe what I had heard. And I was like, I'll be there right now. And I went to Homeboys. And then I remember walking up to Homeboys with my wife and looking in. And I remember looking at her. We always talk about this to this day. I looked there, I said, I seen all the gang members. I looked in, I seen gang members everywhere, tattoos everywhere. And I looked there, I said, this place ain't for me. Because I was so afraid, once again, of being hurt. I was so afraid of the experiences that I had experienced. I was afraid, you know, of what I thought was going to be the outcome of being around gang members. And I had like PTSD, so I go into the lobby and I'm ready for anything, you know. And she's sitting next to me, and I remember telling her, if anything happens, just go to the car, start the car, and I'll be out there soon. I'm filling out my intake form, and there's a homie, his name is Mario, he works in the cafe. He's all tatted. He has the most tattoos I've ever seen in my life. He has his eyelids tatted, everything tatted. And I noticed him notice me, and I put the clipboard down. As soon as I noticed that, I put the clipboard down. And now he's coming towards me. And in my mind, I'm thinking, like, everything I thought was gonna happen is gonna happen now. And the closer he gets to me, the more my heart begins to pound. And then he walks up to me and does something very fascinating. He reaches out his hand. He says, my name is Mario. I've never seen you here before. Are you thirsty? Would you like some water? And I remember looking at him going, what the? And even I couldn't believe it, because then I started to assume, well, maybe he just walked up to me so he could read my tattoos. And I always waited for the next shoe to drop. And it never did. And these experiences, they begin to reshape the way that I seen the world, like the way that I saw gang members, because I had my view of gang members as well. And so I was the oldest of 5. I had a little brother that was, so when my mother passed away, my siblings were pretty much on their own. And I had my baby brother, who was staying at my grandmother's house. It wasn't a healthy place for him to be. I ended up bringing him to my house where I lived. And I asked Father Greg, after I got hired, I said, hey, can we bring my brother in? And he was like, sure, son, we'll get him into school and we'll give him a job and he can go to school part-time and he can work part-time. And my little brother, back in those days, he didn't speak. The only way he knew how to express himself was physically, was violently. And I didn't know why at the time, but I found out later on. He didn't even talk to me. There was times where I would look at him and I thought he didn't like me. Like, I would ask him, like, hey, are you good? Do you like me? Because he would like Mad Dog a lot. And he had been through a lot already. But he was broken. And back then, we didn't have a lot. So I was like 50 pounds thinner back then. And if I had these pants on today, my brother would have them on tomorrow. And we wouldn't ask anybody for anything because we felt like if we asked anybody for anything, they would expect something in return. So we would just swap out clothes. But people at Homeboy Industries, they would notice that. And they would try to help any way they could. And so one day my brother and I, we come in, and the homie Eddie, who had answered the phone call, he says, hey, Father G wants to talk to you guys. And I remember looking at my brother going like, what did you do, homie? And we're waiting for Father Greg, and we go into his office, and he's sitting across from his desk, and he has these 2 Sears cards in his hands. And he reaches across his desk and he says, hey, go buy your guys yourself some clothes, son. And we're like, nah, we don't need any clothes, we're good. And he says, please, son, go buy your guys yourself some clothes. And we take the gift cards and we leave. And we're going down Alameda. And my little brother starts to sob. He's crying, like sobbing uncontrollably. And it was a trip because when we were young, I was always telling my brother, like, don't cry. Like, no matter what, don't ever cry, don't ever show anybody weakness because they'll take advantage of you. And now my little brother is in tears and he's sobbing. And I ask him, I go, why are you crying? And he says, why the fuck do they care about us? Like, he couldn't understand it, why somebody would care about us so much. And in that moment, something happened in my heart. It was like my heart was altered forever in that moment. Because I seen something in my little brother, like something special. And I seen that he was worthy of that love. And that's what it was all about. Like, they seen something in us that we couldn't even see in ourselves. And they loved us until we were able to love ourselves. And that's what happens there for homies that walk through the doors. And that's what Father G's been doing for over 32 years, is seeing the worth and the value in all people. And creating experiences and connecting people to people that they can have that experience and know that they're worthy despite of anything they've been through or anything that they've done. And it altered my heart. And I remember like thinking to myself, I didn't share with anybody, but I was like I want to be a part of this. Like, I want to be a part of what just happened to my little brother. And it was a challenge, it was a struggle. I had to not only face that I wasn't a gang member, so I didn't know who I was. I had an identity crisis. If I wasn't this, who I thought I was for all these years, then who was I? I had to understand that there was, I had anxiety, and I had certain things that I needed to work with somebody through. And then I had to understand that I had an addiction problem as well. But it was in all these different things. See, Homeboy is very unique and special. Like, we have a lot of stuff under one roof. We're blessed like that. Where I didn't know anything about recovery. I had never been locked up for drugs besides the time for selling drugs as a kid. All my cases were violent crimes, so I never got drug tested coming out. I never had to go to AA meetings or NA meetings. But at Homeboys, there was other gang members that were spoon-feeding that to us. They were like, hey, what about this? And what do you think about that? And in the classes, it was subtle. And I could relate to some of the conversations. And then I had to go, I went to rehab. I had never in my life, I remember paroling from my first term, and because I didn't have an address, the parole officer said, we're going to send you to rehab. And I remember telling him, I'd rather be locked up than be in a rehab. because I never thought I had any addiction or substance abuse problems. I thought I'm a gang member, and if I'm going to be anywhere in an institution, it's going to be incarcerated. And I remember sitting with the homie, and he shared his story with me, and I related to his story, and he said, just give it a shot. And I did, and I remember being in the rehab, and the things that they were talking about, I identified with. But all these things were able to happen, not because of the resources that Homeboy offers, but because of the people that I was able to connect to first. And that's one of our philosophies, is we say that we want to connect people to people first, and then people to resources, because some of us can't just trust the first person we meet. Even if you are offering a resource, some of us might not even say, I need this, based off of whatever thoughts or ideas or principles or values that we live by. So it was vital for me to connect to certain people that were able to get me to the other side of my trauma. And I'm privileged now, and I guess another special thing is that, so I started off on maintenance, cleaning toilets, and I felt like I belonged there, so I didn't care what I did. I just wanted to be a part of Homeboys, and I felt proud to wear the t-shirt. So I did toilets, and then eventually I became a part of the security we and then I was able to become a part of workforce development. And then there was this opportunity we were going to start our own fire crew. And I thought, like, you know what, that's what I'm going to do in my life, because I've always been very physical. And I thought, I'm getting my life together. I got recovery, I'm working the steps. I got a sponsor. I think that this is the right decision for me. And I started to work with the fire crew. We were going to do wildland firefighting. And then they offered me a position called a navigator position, to be like hope in the flesh, to be someone that has come through the program and have a caseload along with the case manager, and to kind of like help people through their program, and honestly, like through their life, through the things that they're going through, and just be there for them, just to walk with them. And I took that job, and I shared it. I just came back from a retreat, and like a lot of the stuff that I've been through, I can't explain it without saying that they were divine. A lot of the things that I didn't want to do, I did, and because of that, there was direct divine results that I can say happened in my life. One of them was like all this, like most of the stuff that I had been through, it had a lot to do with the relationship I had with my mom. And I had resentment for myself, and I had regrets for not being able to be there for her. And I also had a lot of pain still. And I was asked to go to this like day retreat, and there was going to be a lot of young homies that had been getting released from YA. And I was still working through a lot of things at this time. And there was this young man, and I remember seeing him, and I was judging him. Throughout the day, I would see him and the way he was interacting with people, and I was thinking like, oh man, he thinks he's a gangster still. In my head, I was judging him. And as the day went by, I wanted to leave, I was probably getting frustrated. I wanted to go home. We didn't have service where we were at. And there was going to be one last session, and it was a meditation session. And everyone was getting into groups. We were getting into these circles. And the young man that I was judging throughout the day, who I didn't know anything about, ended up in my circle and sitting pretty close to me, and still trying not to pass judgment, but passing judgment. And we did our meditation, and then we opened our eyes, and there was another Jesuit priest in there, and he knew this young man personally. He knew his story. And he asks him to share. He says, hey, his name was Joe. My name's Jose. It was just a trip, just the things that started to come out of this experience. And he says, hey, Joe, share about what you shared with me earlier. And then you see like this young man who I thought was trying to still be a gangster start to get vulnerable. And you can see him become more like childlike. And he says that when they asked him to roll it up, that he was going to go home, he didn't believe them, because they had messed with him in the past and joked around, and he had got his stuff packed, and then they had laughed at him. So he said he didn't want to pack up his belongings because he felt like he wasn't going to go home. And then his cellie, he tells a story about his cellie. He says that his cellie convinced him. He's like, well, just pack up half of your stuff so you can be at least half ready if they do open the cell and you do go home. So he convinced him to pack up half of his stuff. And then the Jesuit priest, he asks him a little more, but tell us also about the other part of why you didn't want to pack up your stuff. And he says, well, part of me didn't want to go home because my mom had died while I was locked up. And I just remember like all the judgment that I had for him, or anything I thought I knew about him, it was gone in an instant. And this kid ended up in my arms. Like, he began to sob because he wanted to come home to his mother. His mother didn't get to visit him too. That was another thing, because she was undocumented. And he was sobbing. And this kid who I was tempted to pass judgment on, I ended up holding him as he cried and sobbed because of his pain. And I remember like telling him, like, and I was sobbing as well. And I was holding him and I was telling him, like, everything's gonna be all right. And it felt as if I was holding myself. And I found healing in these moments. And I was so thankful that I had chose to do that with my life, to be there for others. I heard another homie, he says, when you give of yourself, you find yourself. And I never knew what that meant, but I know what that means now. And so I'm grateful to be a part of this organization, to be able to do the work that doesn't feel like work, it feels like life purpose, to be able to give of myself, to find myself, and to work with the population that we work with at Homeboy Industries. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah? Okay. All right. All right. So my name is Janet Soto. I'm a case manager at Homeboy Industry, and just like Jose, I also started as a trainee, junior staff. It's a lot of the stories that Jose was sharing. I mean, I could relate with it, but at the same time, it's like I know how it was when he was first started, because I was there, kind of watching, because I was through the process. When I first got hired at Homeboys, we used to have a lottery, and it was like sitting there. I sat in that chair maybe for like four or 5 months before I actually got a number, and here comes Jose, and I was like, damn, why does he get the royal treatment? But not knowing his story, but it's just kind of a thought of like, you see other people and you're judging without even knowing the story behind it, But before even I started steps into heading to Homeboys, my parents were both undocumented. They both came from Mexico, trying to find the California dream life. And they both were hardworking parents. They work more than 8 hours a day, so that meant that there was nobody at home. I remember, like, when I would go to school, I would expect, when we would get awards or we'd do something like a dance, I would always like see other kids with their parents, and I was always looking at that door, like hoping, my mom or my dad would walk in, and never walked in. It's like, damn, all right, here goes, at graduation, 6th grade, same thing. And the same thing with my siblings. I'm also the oldest in my household, and it's 4 of us. And my sister and myself are the ones that head on to the direction of the streets, and the reason we head onto the street, it was that our friends were the ones that were there for us, was receiving us. I think a lot of it was a lot of the acknowledgement that we received in the streets, from the homies, like, oh, that's right, homegirl, you're down, Every fight, everybody gives you props, because you beat up someone, so that just kind of makes you feel good, And you start as little kids, but you don't realize how, like, it just gets deeper and deeper as it's going. And so my sister and myself, we became crime partners, we're jumping people, we're stealing cars, we're robbing people, we're doing the most in the streets. And my mom would even turn around and say, like, wow, I should have had the boys first before I had the females, like, you guys are just out of control. And we're like, well, wow, it is what it is. And eventually we lost the respect for her. We would just walk in and out of the house whenever we wanted to. And that's how it kind of went, because at the same time, my mom was working a lot, and then she became alcoholic, and she had lost her brother, and she got caught up in her own pain. And my dad used to work out of state, so I wouldn't see my dad from Monday through Friday until Friday night, and then the weekend. So there was at times like my mom was going through some moments where she couldn't stand my sister or myself, and she would kick us out to the street, and we wouldn't come back until that Friday night. Well, Friday afternoon, she would go look for us. And just because she knew my dad was coming home, like she wanted to make sure that she at least showed that that she cared, at that moment. And so that's how it kind of went on for a couple years. And I ended up meeting my husband at he's part of my same neighborhood that I grew up on, and I ended up getting married and pregnant at the age of 17. And when that happened, I thought, oh yeah, like that's my exit out, from living like that, being in the streets. And I moved to Chicago. And one thing that attracted me from him was that all the stuff that was glorified, right? He was like my older homeboy. He had the respect. He had the money. Just everything that goes around it. So we moved to Chicago, and then that's when I got to see more of him, of like what really he did. And just to say, he was actually a cartel. I ended up having 3 kids with him. And yeah, I had everything, but it came with a price, and nothing was easy. I never had friends. I've always had to like stay, home, never really talk to my family. I was really shut down, once every 6 months I was able to see my family. Then I became very depressed, but I also was addicted to it because he was abusive. So I was part of this cycle of abuse. And it went on for a couple years of domestic violence. And, he'll come home drunk and wherever he was at, and I was always with the kids. And one time he took off. He had a flight to Mexico. And I know that it was kind of weird because he was in like kind of hesitant of going. And we will always have like codes, and we always had like, okay, if from this time I don't call you, something happened. And so I didn't receive that call, and I was already worried, and something inside's like, damn, something happened, like something's wrong. Sure enough, my husband ended up getting kidnapped and killed in Mexico. So that same when I found out that same day, I just grabbed my 3 girls and came back to LA. And I remember just grabbing clothes, leaving everything behind, house, cars, whatever. I didn't care about none of that. I just cared about the safety of my 3 daughters and myself. And I remember being on the plane. I already had arrived in LAX, and my sister already calling, and she's like, hey, you need to get out of your house. I was like, yeah, I know. As a matter of fact, I'm already here. I'm already in LA. Pick me up. I'm in LAX. She picks me up, and I come back to my mom's house. So I knew the last time that I was there was like when I was 17, and my mentality was still, that's all I knew, the gangbanging world, and it was really easy for me to reconnect. And so I went back into that household, and my brothers were older. One of my brothers, he's like 7 years younger than I am. He ends up getting into a neighborhood. So at that point, the house is already, my sister's like full active. It was in a good environment, but I had nowhere else to go. And so we, all the homies were hanging out there, and there was a lot of like in and out. It was tough, and I ended up getting myself caught up in drugs. I just, having 3 kids, I had just lost my husband. I had no sense of direction, and I remember like trying to get help from family, and my family was so easy to just judge me and point the finger and see, you should have done this, you should have done that. But I still, at the end of the day, I still didn't get no help. And then I ended up redoing my life with somebody else. I met someone. Well, he ends up getting killed as well. So here I am with 4 kids. At that time when he gets killed, because of what had happened, it happened outside from my house. They end up removing my kids from the house, which my kids were not there, but they still felt like it was endangerment for them. So my kids get removed. And so I tried my best And I kept on pushing myself to try to help myself get sober, but it just for some reason, you know, drugs at that point it's already had gotten too far where it's like I couldn't stop. And I kept on going in and out of rehab. I would go for a week, 2 weeks, and then I would run. And then it just kept on going with my courts. And then I started getting too much involved with the neighborhood. And I just went on survival mode. And then I just had this anger in me, like just pissed off at the world. Like I just didn't care and I gave up. You know, I gave up on everything. And I remember just like doing a lot of damage, you know, and getting myself caught up in these relationships that were also no good, you know. They were all domestic violence. And the last relationship that was toxic, actually the guy ended up killing himself in front of me. And part of that, I was like, damn, like, I thought I would snap out of it, and I still kept on going, you know. But the only thing I was thinking is like, damn, like looking back now, like thankfully my kids were not even in the house when all this happened. And I still went on this rampage until I went on the run for a whole year. And that's because of a crime that I had committed along with two other individuals. And after that year, I think I was so burned out that I remember that I just gave up. Like I was just tired. I remember that day clearly, like if it was yesterday. I remember looking at my mom. She was watering the grass, and looking at her, and she's like, she would get pissed off at me, like when I would come back to the house, because she knew what was going to happen next, that either the house was going to get raided. And I just said, I'm done. I'm done running. And so I ended up calling who I knew there was a local, you know, snitch. And I told her, hey, you know, you could call your friends. Tell them I'm not running no more. I'm here. Just let them know that I'll be here. So I'm you know, brushing my hair. I'm cool. Next thing you know, I see that gun right behind me. And it's like, they're like, freeze, don't move. And he just yells out, U.S. Marshals. I was like, damn, that was quick. And sure enough, you know, he was there within three minutes. I was like, damn. So I mean, that they were just right there, just, you know, watching me. And next thing you know, you have all these agents, you know, sheriffs inside my house. And it was just different this time. And I remember seeing my mom crying in the front. She's yelling and saying she's innocent. All she needs is help. Like, let her go, you know? And I told my mom, looking at her eyes, and I told her, which was different now, I said, I'm just tired. You just let it be, you know, for now. I'll be okay. I fought my case for 2.5 years. I fought my case. I was looking at 25 years. And I remember when I first went in, I remember meeting my attorney, and he introduced himself. He's like, hey, I'm Jesus. I'm here to help you. I was like, oh my God, I thought I stopped using drugs, you know? But, you know, this man was the first man I ever trusted in my life. And I was able to instantly, I don't know, something about him that I was able to trust him, you know? And he helped and fought, and he heard my story, and he became automatically compassionate to it and understanding. And he said, I'm gonna fight for you all the way. And he did, you know. I ended up I was sentenced to 6 years, and but I ended up getting a strike though. But at that moment, I was like, I just want to go home, you know. But so I just finished my time and ended up doing 3.5 years. And I remember getting released, and my mom picked me up, and I kept on telling her, like, she couldn't believe I was actually out. And I was like, I told you I was gonna be out, you know, like, I'll be okay, but I'm gonna promise you it's gonna be different. And she's like, yeah, you always say the same thing. I'll give you a couple days. And I'm like, no, I'm gonna prove to you. And kept on going, moving forward. I was released on a Saturday, and from a Saturday to Monday, I had to report to my PO. And I knew on that weekend, it went all bad, because, you know, it's just that first taste, I already knew it. I had all the homies show up and all the people that I did not want to see, the things that I kept on telling myself when I was in prison, like I'm not going to do. Sure enough, that weekend, that exactly happened. But I didn't get in trouble though. I knew that I had to go see him on that Monday. And when I arrived to his office, and as soon as he told me, like, what's the address, I'm like, you know what? I don't know what address I'm going to give you because I don't know where I'm going. He's like, okay. I'm like, all I know, I don't want to go back to my mom's. So he's like, all right, so you willing to do residential? I'm like, yeah, not really, but I guess, I have no other options. So let's give it a try. He goes, well, give me 6 months and you'll be good. I'm like, all right, I'll do 6 months. I have nothing else to lose. So I did 6 months in residential, and then once they were about to give me the boot, I asked for 6 more months. And I was like, I'm not ready. I said, I still need more time. Throughout those other 6 months that I was there, they're like, well, you need to start looking for a job and kind of get you started. So when I was there, I ended up getting 2 different jobs doing desk work. I was pretty fast on learning things. So, and I remember one job that I actually liked this place. And because of my background and whatever came up, I was hired within like a couple weeks, and then I was escorted out. And that day, I remember when they escorted me, I was so embarrassed. And I even left that place crying because they treated me the way they treated me. And I felt like I was treated again like a criminal all over again. And I remember walking out, and one of my roommates said, Janet, give it a try, go to Homeboys. And I'm like, nah, I ain't trying to go over there. But then I kept on thinking about it as the days went by. I was like, damn, I don't have nothing else to lose. Like, I don't want to go back to the neighborhood. I don't want to go back to what I know. I know I want something different, but I don't know what. I just needed the opportunity. So that's how I ended up at Homeboys. And I really, when I started Homeboys, I really didn't know what I was going there for. I just say, this is my last resort. I said, if they can't hire me, and then if they can't give me opportunity, like, it's going to go back to the neighborhood, And it was awkward because I kept on fighting with it too. Like, I was scared. I don't know why I was scared. But I remember even saying to my friend, like, I ain't trying to be around no gang members. Like, I've done that all my life. Like, I'm done with them. And she's just like, give it a try. So we went. She's like, we both went, and she ended up getting hired first too. And so we, at the minute I walked in, I don't know, it's something about Homeboys that I got this instant welcoming and receiving. And not only that, I just felt connected, and I felt like I belonged. And I think the most important, like Jose said, I felt like I was seen. That first time in my life, somebody had addressed me and said, hey, I'm here to help you, and addressed me by my name, not by my nickname, but by my name. And that just kept on, like, inside of me, like, wanting to come back for more. And I waited. I started my process in May, and I actually didn't get hired until September the 3rd. I still remember to this day, 2013. And I remember when I got hired, I was so proud to wear those T-shirts. They gave me 3 T-shirts, and I ironed my T-shirts all nice, and I hanged them up, and I couldn't wait until to start. And the reason was I couldn't wait. It was just like, finally I had an opportunity to live. And I don't know what it was, but I knew that I was going to live, and it wasn't going to be suffering anymore. That's right. And I just had like this hope inside me, and I kept on like just moving forward. I was very silent when I first started. I just really, really quiet. Just I will watch everyone. I even thought he was conceited. It's like, I ain't talking to that dude. No. But it kept me. Trust was an issue for me, to be able to trust, because I felt like so many people let me down. And it started all with my mom, my dad. When every moment I would want to see them coming out through those doors, and it's like, damn, they weren't there, and the acknowledgement. I might remember my first birthday at Homeboys. I even had like balloons flying down the second floor, everybody singing happy birthday. And I felt special. And that gave me to like a motivation to strive for more. And throughout the process that I was there, I did the therapy. I did every class that I could think of that it's there. I was part of this restorative justice that forever going to be grateful for. That helped me throughout the process. My mom had 4-stage cancer. And my biggest fear was that when my mom does pass away, that I was going to go back into what I knew best because of the hurt that I felt before. And because of Homeboys that I was there, they were my sisters that were in there with me, were able to hold me through the process, and I was able to forgive myself, and I was able to forgive my mom. And even to the last breath that she took, I remember after that same day, like I get that phone call from Shirley that I could still hear her, which she's our director, and telling me everything's gonna be okay. We got you, you know. And there was this family that I kept on yearning for years, you know, and I kept on thinking like, damn, you know, like I never had this. And it was kind of weird because at times I felt like running away from it because it was so weird and I wasn't used to it. But at the same time, it was like my new addiction because I wanted more, and I kept on coming. And throughout the whole process, I still did my internship. And that helped me through it as well, and develop my skills as a case manager. I did that for 6 months, work with the homeless population, and without no judgments to continue to help these people. And then when I finished that process, I became a navigator. They offered me an opportunity, but before even then, I actually applied for a position. It was a director's position. Everybody thought I was crazy, and I said, well, I'm just giving it a shot. Doesn't matter. I ain't gonna lose. All they're gonna say is no, but another door's gonna open. And sure enough, it was like that. I actually exposed myself to opportunity that, yes, I didn't get that position, but I did get a navigator position that was offered right there and there. And I remember talking to Hector when he was like, he's just talking to me, and he says, you know, I think that you have the right qualities to become a navigator. And I had nobody has ever given me that opportunity. And I was like, with no hesitation, I said, yes, I'm in for it. And I didn't know throughout the journey of those 2 years that I was, it's funny, they called me Michael Myers, you know, I was very raw. I was very like, black and white. It's like if you any little movie you'll make, it's like, hey, where you going? Come on, get a class, you know. But that's all I knew, because I knew that if I structure myself, I would do good. So if I help somebody else to structure themselves, I knew they would do good too. But then until I stepped in the role as a case manager, when I started discovering different. When I really started more, and that started with myself, that I started loving myself even more, becoming more compassionate, and going, as Jose talked about, the retreats, you know, going on the retreats and going with not just my team, but also going with trainees there and hearing their stories. And it does something to you that you just want to be part of it, and you want to be part of that journey with them. And I actually stepped in twice as a substance, case manager, and then a position came about, and I've been a case manager already for a year, which I love doing. I'm there. I mean, the homies will come in and they're like, I need support. I need somebody to go with me to court. When? Let's go. You know, I need this. I'm like, what do you need? How can I help you? I love being at service, because at one point I remember when I needed all those things that needed for me, nobody was there for me. And I just know I could relate with that, you know. And I think at Homeboys, that's what we do. We're there, we care for each other. Even the simple phone calls, hey, you know, hope you have a good weekend. That even helps, you know. Recently, and that's another blessing, that recently, and just in April, my 20-year-old daughter moved in with me. You know, after 20 years, they were adopted. She's the first one that actually moved in with me. I'm also now having a better relationship with my son, that he's already 13 years old, you know, that I'm able to go and see him and watch the games. I don't think I ever would have been able to do none of this stuff, and I didn't have the tools that I have at Homeboys, and to be able to be a mom, you know, because that's hard, because I didn't have that relationship with my mom. And so like now I'm able to be present, not just at Homeboys, but I'm able to be present at home. So thank you for having me.
Good evening. My name's David Thompson, and I am a judge in the State Court of Appeal, which sits in Santa Ana, and I've been doing that since 2012. And prior to that, I was a judge in the Orange County Superior Court for about 15 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some of the reforms, the exciting things that we're doing here in California to reform the criminal justice system, to try to make it more humane and to be more accommodating to people. Before I start, though, I do want to thank Dr. Tarrant for organizing this and inviting us to be here, and I want to again thank Jose and Janet for allowing me to be here with them. I'm super honored and privileged to be here. So the problem and its origins, from my perspective as a judge, I've been a criminal justice system insider for the last 22 years. Incidentally, on a personal note, prior to that time, I also had my own struggles with alcohol and drugs, but that's a different talk for a different night. But just so you know where I'm coming from, I have an interest in these issues, a personal interest. But the fact of the matter is the United States has the highest incarceration rates of any any country in the world. Tonight, about 2 million people will call jail or prison home. That amounts to about 655 persons per 100,000 in our population. Now that's down from a peak of about 767 per 100,000 in 2007, but it's up dramatically from about 161 per 100,000, which was 1972. In California, we hit our high mark in terms of total incarcerated persons, about 173,000 people. We hit that high mark in 2006. Now, as a result of some of the reforms that I'm going to talk about tonight, we're down to about 115,000. So we're down about 30% on our total incarcerated population in California as we speak tonight. Just a couple other things about the mass incarceration problem. There are significant racial disparities. For example, if you happen to be African American, your chances are almost 6 times greater of being incarcerated. If you happen to be Hispanic, your chances are about twice as great for the ordinary white male population. The contributors to this problem, from my perspective, it started with the war on drugs in the 1970s. This was a major forerunner to the tough on crime measures that came later in California. There was this idea that addiction is a crime, not a disease, and so we started to incarcerate people for being addicts. It's estimated that roughly 1 in 5 state and federal prisoners are incarcerated for drug-related offenses. And the vast majority of people that are incarcerated were under the influence when they committed whatever the offense was that ended up in them being incarcerated. Turning to the tough on crime measures, for example, from 1984 to 1991, there were some 1,000 crime bills that were passed and enacted in California. Tough on crime, tough on crime, tough on crime. Every politician was running on a campaign of being tough on crime. These things really transformed the system in ways that are, in my view, quite unfortunate. They're limiting the trial judge's sentencing discretion, resulting in sort of systematically excessive prison sentence. They have mandatory minimums, harsher penalties, longer sentences. We saw higher failure rates on parole. You had things like 3 strikes and 10-20 life and other mandatory sentencing schemes that I'm going to talk about in more detail here in a few minutes. We started treating juveniles like adults in the criminal justice system, not recognizing the lack of adolescent brain development, the poor choices that these kids were making. We started treating them and holding them responsible as if they were adults. Another thing that happened was we placed a lot more discretion in the prosecutors and their charging decisions, and so while the trial judge's sentencing discretion was being diminished, the prosecutor's charging authority and discretion was being increased, and so there was kind of a balance of power or a shift there. And over this whole period of time, the rationale for incarceration was also changing. We were getting away from rehabilitation and focusing more on retribution incapacitation, just taking people off of the street, and deterrence. And this was all driven by public safety fears, and as I said before, campaigns, politicians running on these tough on crime bills. Everybody wanted to be tough on crime. The net result was, by 2009, the prisons in California had reached a bursting point. There was litigation concerning the constitutionality of the healthcare system within the prison system, and in 2009, the federal courts placed a cap on the number of people that could be incarcerated in the penitentiaries in California. We were operating at that point at about a 200% of capacity. They had people sleeping on cots in gymnasiums. They didn't even have cells for everybody. Since that federal court order, though, and with Governor Brown, there's been California's really been at the forefront of the efforts to reduce mass incarceration over the past 10 years or so. So here's some of the specific things that we've been doing. It started really in 2011 with the realignment legislation. This was an initiative that was dreamed up by Governor Brown. The idea basically was to shift people out of prison and put them in the county jails. The result was some people in county jail got put on probation, and some people that were on formal probation got put on informal probation. So there was kind of a cascade effect. But the idea was to get people out of prisons, put them in the local areas where they could receive more services, and we started shifting more towards rehabilitation. Prop 47, I'm going to talk about in some detail. We reduced the penalties for certain types of crimes. And then Prop 57, we allowed more inmates to be released for early good behavior. And so the net result, as I said, was kind of a more humane and just system. But the realignment thing, what it was non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offenders, instead of serving their terms in the state penitentiary, were sent to the county jail, sometimes for more than a year. It used to be if you committed any kind of a felony and were going to be incarcerated for more than a year, you went to the penitentiary. We started holding those people in the county jail. It also limited parole violations, which was a big problem because the recidivism rates, or the number of people that went back on violations, was really high. This law limited parole violations to 180 days in the county jail. They could no longer send you back to the penitentiary. And they also incorporated these 10-day flash incarceration things where people were struggling with drugs or alcohol. You could put them in jail, sober them up a little bit, connect them with some services, and hopefully get them pointed in the right direction. So that was the realignment legislation in 2011. Then we had the 3 strikes reform in 2012. You're probably familiar with this law. This is a law that it's an alternative sentencing scheme, and basically if you're a second-time offender, you get twice the amount of time in prison that you would have got otherwise. If you're a third-time offender, you get 25 to life. And the idea was to catch violent criminals, career criminal murderers, rapists, and take them off the street as soon as possible. But the reality of what happened was there was lots of low-level offenders who got caught up in this system. You've probably heard the story about the person that stole a chocolate chip cookie, got 25 to life, that kind of thing. That was because the qualifying third offense for a third strike 25 to life sentence did not have to be a serious or violent crime. It could be any felony, not a misdemeanor, but any felony. Petty theft with a prior could get you 25 to life. So Proposition 36 amended that 3 strikes law, and now you're not even eligible for a third strike sentence unless your current offense is a serious or violent felony. Then came Prop 47. This was to reclassify most drug and certain theft offenses. This was to make things like simple possession of methamphetamine, simple possession of heroin or cocaine a misdemeanor, which is the way the law used to be before all these tough on crime measures made them felonies, or in some cases they were what was known as wobblers, where the DA had the discretion to file the case as a felony instead of a misdemeanor, and they always filed them as a felony because it bumps their statistics. It gives them a chance to lock people up. As a net result of Prop 47, immediately 15,000 people were released from prison. And we saved $68 million a year in the first year alone as a result of Prop 47. Another measure was the 1020 life, use a gun, you're done reform. This is another sentence enhancement scheme. If you use a gun during the commission of a crime, you get 10, 20, or 25 to life, depending upon how you use the gun. As it was originally enacted, it was a mandatory sentence. The judge had no discretion whatsoever, had to impose it in every case where the true finding was made by the jury. It's now been reformed in 2019, so judges now have the discretion to strike the enhancement in the interest of justice if the facts and circumstances of the crime, the defendant, and so on warrant the judge exercising some discretion. Another thing we've reformed just within the last year is the felony murder rule. This is a rule that allows a co-defendant who's not a direct perpetrator of the crime to be held responsible for something like a murder that they didn't actually commit, but they were present in part of the crime that was going on around that murder. We've tightened up on that substantially now. And there's also been some Supreme Court decisions that say that the person can only be held to the same level of culpability if they have substantial involvement in the crime and they have the same mental state as the person who actually committed the murder. So that's a big change. Eyewitness identification reforms. We all know that wrongful eyewitness identification is a major cause for wrongful convictions. We have a new law that requires law enforcement to adopt regulations for conducting photo and in-person lineups to ensure that they're reliable and they result in accurate suspect identifications. You probably heard of this, the six-pack lineup. They take 6 photos and they show them. Now there's a whole set of regulations around that stuff so that it's not unduly suggestive. So, for example, if someone who looked like Jose was reported to have committed crime, you put him in a 6-pack lineup with 3 African-American guys and 2 white guys, all that have big bushy hair, but the suspect was somebody who had a shaved head. Not too surprising, the supposed victim or eyewitness will sometimes identify the guy. In other words, the photo lineups were suggestive. That's what I'm saying. Sentencing credit parole release reforms. This is Prop 57, which was enacted in 2016. This allows inmates to seek early parole if they get credits for good behavior and if they complete approved education and rehabilitation programs. So this is an idea to get people to do the right thing and work with the available resources in the prison system to try to get some rehabilitation going. This allows a lot more people to be released early than ever before, and among them are a lot of youthful offenders. This is resulting in about 7,000 or 8,000 parole hearings a year that would not have occurred under existing law. Then we come to the juvenile justice reforms. I highlighted this a little bit ago. There's a line of Supreme Court cases. The U.S. Supreme Court is actually leading the way on this charge, and there were two major cases that they decided within the last 10 years that have really changed the game altogether. These cases are based upon the science which talks about adolescent brain development, especially amongst male adolescents, and the fact that their higher decision-making and good judgment functions of their brain are now not fully developed, we know, until you're about age 25 on average. So Graham was the first case that said a juvenile could not be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for a non-homicide offense. That's based on 8th Amendment cruel and unusual grounds. And then we had Miller, no more mandatory life without possibility sentences for juveniles. Even for homicide offenses, you had to look at the consideration of the specific circumstances and the level of development of the youth involved. Then came in California, Prop 57. We changed the rules so that prosecutors can no longer file against juveniles in adult court the way that they could as a result of some of those tough on crime measures. We put it back to the way that it was before the 1990s. Now they have to go to a juvenile court judge and they have to make a showing to the juvenile court judge as to why this particular juvenile should be tried in adult court. The consequences are dramatic. If the juvenile goes to adult court, he could face life without the possibility of parole. If he goes to the juvenile court, at most he's going to be incarcerated until he's 25 years old, and then he's going to be released. So it's a big difference, and now the judge is making that decision instead of the prosecutor. There's a lot of other things going on with the juvenile justice system. 8 of the 11 facilities that we had in California have now been closed. There's only about 660 juveniles still in the system. They're mainly 17 to 19-year-olds. Newsom, our new governor, is now shifting responsibility for those kids away from the Department of Corrections altogether and into a separate department, again emphasizing more about rehabilitation instead of straight incarceration. But most exciting for me is we're really in the process of ending the war on drugs. We know that felony drug convictions are down, but more people went to prison for drug offenses every year from the 90s through about 2010. And they have felony drug convictions have all kinds of collateral consequences, and they pose a particularly heavy burden on the communities of color. Great public expense to incarcerate all these people with drug problems. In spite of the research, it shows that a public health response is actually more effective than a criminal justice response for somebody that's got an alcohol and drug problem. There's no relationship between imprisonment rates and rates of drug use, overdose, arrest for drug law violations. So in California, what's going on is there's a growing recognition that prevention and treatment are more effective than incarceration. The fact of the matter is we can't warehouse all the drug addicts that we have in this state. We don't have enough prison beds to hold them all. So we're moving towards viewing addiction as a disease rather than a crime. This is something that Europe has been way ahead of the United States on. But I mentioned Proposition 47, simple possession is now a misdemeanor, it's no longer a felony or a wobbler. You can only get local jail time, you don't get state prison time, you don't have a felony record, less arrests overall. There's also a retroactive aspect to that for people that have old felony convictions can be reclassified as misdemeanors, and their estimate is there's about 1.5 million people in California that might be eligible for reclassification under that law. Also, the federal sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, which was felt to be discriminatory, has been eliminated. So there's a lot of exciting things going on in the way that we're dealing with drug addicts and drug offenders in the system. Here's another exciting thing. It's a couple more, actually. Mental health diversion. There's a new law. This was AB 1810 and some enabling legislation that was enacted in 2018. This is a pretrial diversion program. If a defendant can show that they have a bona fide mental health problem that contributed to the behavior that led to their arrest, and if a doctor will opine that they're amenable to treatment, they can have the criminal proceedings brought to a halt. They can go over and do their mental health treatment, and if they successfully complete their mental health treatment, they can come back to court and they can have that case dismissed. It's a whole new way of looking at mental health issues in the criminal justice system, which is really a square peg in a round hole for a lot of different reasons. And then another really interesting and exciting thing from my perspective are some post-convictions reforms. We got generations of people with felony convictions. 2010, 20 million people in the U.S. had a current or prior felony conviction on their record. And the consequences of a felony arrest live with you for the rest of your life. You got problems with employment, with housing, with education, loss of voting rights. Really, you're a second-class citizen for the rest of your life if you've got a felony conviction. And the research shows that those kinds of disabilities actually contribute to crime rather than reducing crime. Access to jobs being a key factor. If you can get a job, you're much less likely to go back to the life that you were leading before. So what we've been doing in California is expunging these criminal convictions. There's a whole series of laws that have been expanded. It's now the case that if you successfully complete probation, or if you successfully complete your local sentence under the realignment law that I talked about earlier, or even if you went to prison a long time ago on a case that would have been a local case now under the realignment law, and if you have no new offenses, you can get that conviction expunged. It allows you to withdraw the guilty plea or set aside a guilty verdict and get the case dismissed, and it relieves you of all of those penalties and disabilities that used to go with that felony conviction, including a restoration of voting rights. The only things it doesn't do is it still counts as a prior if you get arrested in a new case, and you can't get your right to own a firearm back if you have a violent or serious felony conviction. There's a lot of people that are eligible for this kind of relief that don't even know it. The legislature just enacted a law that's going to make this relief automatic for certain types of cases. Just a couple of other things. Employment protections for ex-offenders. It's now the case that employers are prohibited from asking about, seeking, utilizing criminal convictions that have been set aside or expunged. And the employers can actually get in civil or criminal trouble if they were to violate that law. Occupational licensing reform too. This would be for your any kind of license issued by the state, be it a cosmetology license or a real estate license, whatever it might be. The licensing board cannot deny, revoke, or suspend an occupational license unless the conviction occurred within the preceding 7 years and it substantially relates to the qualifications and duties of that business or profession. Really exciting thing from my perspective, pretrial cash bail reform. I'll just touch on this very briefly because we want to leave time for questions. But last year, we enacted a law that's going to eliminate the cash bail system in California, and they're going to substitute a risk management, risk assessment tool in its place. The cash bail system results in poor people staying in jail until their case is resolved, and the rich people who maybe present at least as great, if not a greater risk, they get out because they have the ability to post bail. So there have been a number of cases that held that system to be unconstitutional, and now we have a statute. That statute is being attacked in the courts. It's being litigated as we speak, and it's going to have to get reviewed by the California Supreme Court. So the bottom line from my perspective as an insider in the criminal justice system is we had all these reforms. We reduced the prison population by more than 30%. Crime rates did not go up, and the reality is that in California and across the country, in fact, we're safer today than we have been at any other time in recent history. So I'm pretty excited about that stuff. And that's my pitch, but we'll take questions. Again, thank you for allowing me to be here. What's AB 32? What's the subject matter? I don't know it by that number.
It's portrayed as a ban on privatization, the privatization of prisons in California.
Okay, I don't know a lot about the privatization of the prison system. I do know that when the capacity of the state prison system as constructed was being exceeded and we couldn't build prisons fast enough, there were people that saw an opportunity to make a lot of money by building private prisons. And we were sending in California, in order to try to keep the population down, we were sending people to out-of-state private prisons for a number of years. It's a terrible idea. If you're sent to Omaha and you're from LA, your family can't visit you. That's a huge problem. You can't stay connected to your community. So when you get paroled, you have no ties left. I believe that there are no California prisoners currently housed in private prisons, or maybe just the last few. Newsom is on a mission to eliminate that thing altogether, and it's not surprising to me that there's a new law that would prevent us from ever going back down that road again.
You recently started to use that word, abolitionist. But I think we, like at Homeboy, over anything, like we hope to abolish the idea that there's a us and a them. So I think not just with the prison abolition, but with the idea that has taken root in the world that there's a us and that there's a them. And so at Homeboy, we stand in, there is no us, there is no them, there's just us. A community that stands in the circle of kinship, and no one stands outside of that circle. So I think in that way we're abolitionists. I think there's this app called Calm.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can download it and get some meditation practice. Nah, I mean, I think that I think it's like we all have when it comes to like technology, I think people coming out of prison struggle with technology just off the top. I myself really struggled with the new phones, and I don't see us right now. I think we have a social platform. I think social platforms can be helpful and impactful if used correctly, and I mean to benefit these movements. But I think like as far as technology, there's nothing I could think of that Homeboy Industries is. We've talked about designing an app that's been in the works, but the work that we do is like it's so important that we're in each other's face, that we're seeing one another. Even like our case management, we really strive to be with the department that we're a part of is to really case manage, but like from being in, like having your client in front of you, to know their needs, to be able to see what's bothering them or see if they're troubled, or because like as far as like case management goes as well, as like some of the people that don't tell you what they need, you got to be seen. And so I think technology can be a barrier at times to some of that stuff. Right now we're a part of an ODR grant where a lot of database, a lot of tracking information, and sometimes that gets ahead of the actual face time spent with individuals. So we're always careful at Homeboys, and especially because that's like a department that I run. So I'm always careful with our teams to not get so caught up in just tracking data and outcomes, but to really have the face time with the clients and the population that we're serving, because I think it's important.
It's kind of hard, but I think it's being consistent. It's depending on the wounds that they each carry. You can't just give them advice. And really try to put yourself in their shoes. Walk their path, really hear them out. Be present. That's very important. Being present, and just like what Jose was answering right now, it's like because we're working on the flesh. So you gotta be there. And then and that would just naturally will develop, and that person will feel comfort, will feel safe, and eventually they'll start coming to you. I mean, not just because at Homeboys I see my clients, I also see other people that are not my clients, that were actually graduates, or because they felt safe. And so that's why they continue to keep on coming back and asking me questions like, oh, you know what, I'm going through this, or they'll call me, hey, what do you think about this? Or I'm going through some emotions, so I think it's just staying available and being consistent with them.
So we do have a local organizing committee. We have civic engagement. One thing I've noticed with our population is it's a sensitive topic, and it's at Homeboy, we believe in healing first. So we've made, G always says that we've made mistakes along the way as far as thinking that a job's going to solve things, or information. And so, just as an example, our slogan used to be, nothing stops a bullet like a job. And we know that's not necessarily the case. Like, nothing stops a bullet like healing, And so we had to reassess our program, and also information when it's being presented. We have to be nurturing and compassionate with information, and we definitely have civic engagement happening on a monthly basis. We have a local organizing committee that we organize around, and when we talk about like systematic oppression, because we've done that before, there's so much complex trauma. And I'll just give you an example of when we go into a prison system, we segregate ourselves. And so there's so much complex trauma and brokenness when we start to break these things down. I remember being in a classroom setting one time, and we started to talk about the history of LA, and I started to see homies getting like upset, very upset. And if there's not a space to process that pain, or that misunderstanding of things that have happened, and then there can be the outcome cannot be so positive. So with anything that we do, we center it around healing. And so if we ever have conversations about systematic oppression or histories of incarceration, or even documentaries, we always make sure that there's enough time and space to have a conversation around healing and how this information connects to our own healing. That's kind of our stance on it.
It's like, oh, sorry. It's a giving like small doses. You know, you never want to give a big dose to somebody that has not done the inside healing. And what happens is that if you do that, like Jose was saying, we'll get triggered, and it's like, okay, shut down, wants to do something else, and runs. You know, they run to the behavior that they're used to, or that it's more comfortable that they know. You know, so for us, it's everything that we do. It's small doses. Even with the process, like when they get hired, you know, they get hired as a part-time, and you start getting some other resources. We can't give them all at once. The same thing. It's just little baby steps, and that's what we do, right? The baby steps, small doses.
Great question. And the answer is I don't think we're doing as much as we should be doing, maybe, but it had to start with the idea that the whole point of incarceration is not just to lock people up. It's not about retribution. It's not just about segregating these people from the rest of us. It's not about locking them up for as long as possible, as soon as possible, which is where we really ended up. It's more about trying to reintegrate these people into society, but it takes a huge amount of resources. There's no question about it. And the money that we've saved on incarceration hasn't now been spent on rehabilitation yet, but we're changing the mindset of the system, and hopefully the resources will follow. And I'm not intimately familiar with the ins and outs of the funding of the various programs, so I can't answer specifics, but I see a change in mentality going on. Especially as it relates to drug and alcohol problems, since that's often the underlying factor. If you can address the alcohol and drug problems, then the other things start to fall into line. As a judge, actually, I don't get involved in advocating for legislation and so on. Generally speaking, there's restrictions under the canons of ethics, that things that can do. One thing I did do is I started a drug court in Orange County where we took people and hooked them up with services and monitored them very closely instead of just locking them up. And we worked with them. We helped them get a GED. We helped them get a job. We helped them find a place to live. We hooked them up with bus services, all kinds of things so they could get established in the community and get on the right path. Meanwhile, they were monitoring, and if they slipped and came up with a positive test, we give them a couple of days in jail to think about it, and then we hook them up with a treatment program when they get out. We were working very closely with them to try to get them pointed in the right direction instead of just housing them. But it's very expensive to do that. There are a lot of collaborative courts in California now. When I started the first drug court in 1998 in the West Justice Center in Orange County, there wasn't very many in California. Yes, the people that were in that system that opted into drug court, they had to make a choice that they wanted to be a part of it, and there were consequences for making that choice. But if they made that choice, they were provided those services by the court system. It's actually, according to the RAND Corporation, about 7 times more effective to spend $1 on rehabilitation than it is on incarceration. So if we even took 1/7 of what we're spending to house people in prison and spend it on rehabilitation, we'd be doing pretty good. You get a way bigger bang for your buck. I think it could. I don't really see much benefit from incarceration beyond a very short period of time. My own experience is the longer you incarcerate somebody, the more institutionalized they become, the more difficult it is for them to get back on their feet in the community. It's my personal belief, and I have to say I'm speaking for myself now, not for the judiciary or the court that I'm a member of any, but that's my personal belief, my experience with the system. Aspiring attorneys? I would say devote yourself to whatever it is that you're studying, which is with as much enthusiasm as you can, and shoot for the moon. There's all kinds of opportunity in the law, and I would just encourage you to be the best student that you can possibly be, and prepare carefully for the LSAT exam, and apply to a bunch of law schools and go to the best law school that you get into, no matter where it is, because it makes a difference. Good luck. I'm not sure I understand that question exactly. When I write an opinion, it disposes of a particular case on the particular facts and the law that applies to those facts for that individual. So I don't get involved so much in the general sort of policy-making aspect of things. But I mentioned the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Same drug, different form. It turns out that crack cocaine was being used in the minority communities more than in the white communities, and there was a vastly different punishment in the federal system for crack cocaine over powder cocaine. And the net result was that a whole lot more African American people got locked up for very long periods of time because they happened to be using crack cocaine instead of powder cocaine. That disparity has now been eliminated. It took a long time. That problem has been known for 20 years, and I think it was only finally resolved within the last year or two. But it's hard as an individual judge to deal with those issues except on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's my reaction to it.
So I think these were all great questions. I know some of the people who asked them have already had to slip out. I would love for you to take my class on gender, sex, and the law. We can talk about how opinions are written and what they can and can't do and all of that. Product placement. Talk to Andrew about it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I know you all have very long days of classes and things, so I just want to